Okay, we'll continue our studies in Ecclesiastes. Chapter 8 is where we will begin. Now, so we get into chapter 8, just a reminder of wisdom literature, generally speaking, particularly Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, that we're kind of trained, and rightly so, we're kind of trained when we read Scripture that it's talking about spiritual things. It is talking about how to get to heaven when we die. But when we're in wisdom literature, that's often not the case. Sometimes it is, and even in Ecclesiastes, that's going to be his ultimate conclusion, if you will, as he says, to the whole matter. But on the road to get there, much of what Solomon has to say isn't necessarily saying, here's what you need to do to obey God, to necessarily even being pleasing to God, and certainly not to get to heaven, but here's what you need to do, or here's at least the frame of mind you need to have to just enjoy earth, to just enjoy this life. And so remember, there's two tracks that he's taking, and that is how to enjoy the proper perspective and view of life and how to enjoy your life on earth while preparing for eternity. And that, to me, if that's the great lesson, if you get nothing else out of this study, is that God wants both for us. I think sometimes we have this misconception. I think surely the world does, but I think even sometimes as Christians we do. We're thinking of it's a choice, either earth or heaven. I could be a sinner and enjoy earth, but then I'll miss heaven. Or I can be a Christian and be miserable on the earth, but then at least I get heaven. And for some, that might be a legitimate choice. I think of those first century Christians and the persecution that they had, that they did experience a lot of misery because of their faith here on earth. But generally speaking, I think the wise man here is telling us no, you can enjoy this life, this earth, better by being a God centered person. And then certainly you have to be a God centered person to enjoy heaven and eternity. But even this life. And so I say all that to say this, especially here in chapter 8. It's other places in Ecclesiastes, but it jumped out to me here in chapter 8 that my mind is going almost naturally wants to interpret these verses in view of some kind of deep spiritual lesson, when many of these are just saying, no, this is just about this life. And there's that phrase, under the sun, that should be our biggest clue into all of that. So, all right, before we get into the text, any questions or comments about what we've studied prior in the first 7 chapters? If not, chapter 8, verse 1 says, who is like a wise man? So again, let's pause there. We didn't get very far, did we, before we had to stop? But even in understanding that, how does Solomon mean a wise man? And now, we would normally want to think, well, a wise man is a man who that serves and follows God, and that may be the case, but with much of his focus being earthbound under the sun, he might just be talking about a wise man here on earth that may be wise in not in devilish, demonic things, but wise in just earthly wisdom. And so we're going to have to let the context tell us. So who is like a wise man? And who knows the interpretation of a thing? A wise man's wisdom, or a man's wisdom, makes his face shine, and the sternness of his face is changed. Solomon has kind of diminished the role of wisdom a little bit in this book by saying that wisdom and the pursuit of ultimate wisdom, earthly wisdom, is not the fulfillment. Wisdom, wealth, all of those things that he's saying, they're not going to provide you the ultimate satisfaction in life. And so he's kind of downplayed the importance of wisdom on one hand, but here on the other hand, he's saying that wisdom is still to be preferred to foolishness. It's not the answer to everything. But if you had to choose wisdom. And so in this first verse, he is applauding the role of a wise man. Who is like a wise man? Who has that? Well, nobody other than some other wise man. That this wisdom makes his face shine, and the sternness, my translation says, of his face is changed. And because through this wisdom, his countenance changes. He shines. He can smile because he's figured it out. And so there's, again, he is applauding the idea of wisdom, although he's just argued that wisdom is not the ultimate answer to everything, but again, is to be preferred. I counsel you, verse 2, keep the king's commandment for the sake of your oath to God. Now, there's debate among commentators on to who is the king here, not who the specific king, but scholarship is divided whether the king here is talking about God. God is our ultimate king. He is the King of kings. He's the one to whom we bow down to and obey, and he is certainly referred to as king in Scripture. Or the other side of scholarship says, no, this is talking about an earthly king. uh, David, Solomon, or whoever it might be when you're a citizen in a kingdom. And I would tend to agree that that's probably from this context that is talking about an earthly king, not obeying God. That's obvious. We should do that. But you need to obey the earthly king. Max and then Glenn.
A small K on the king. I would have thought that they'd have made it big king if they thought it was God.
Yeah. So your translators agree with that view. Then it's just talking about an earthly king. Yeah. Glenn.
Mine says, footnote says that the kings are sinners like the rest of mankind. So to me, that indicates earthly king.
Yeah, that would obviously lean us toward an earthly king. Hold your finger here and go to 2 Kings 11. I think we have kind of a corresponding language in 2 Kings 11. This is, chronologically speaking, this is after the book of Ecclesiastes, of course, because now we're in the divided kingdom. But 2 Kings 11, look at verse 17. Then Jehoiada, that's the king, made a covenant between the Lord, the king, and the people, that they should be the Lord's people, and also between the king and the people. And so there's a similar language, the king and God and the people. Three groups instead of just two, not just between the people and God, but between the people and the king. So he's saying, back to Ecclesiastes 8, verse 2, keep the king's commandments for the sake of your oath to God. Um, Now, we could broaden this. The New Testament certainly does. In the book of Romans, chapter 13, tells us that we're to be subject to the higher powers. And in that context, that was an ungodly government, an ungodly king. Now, when Solomon makes this statement, it's a different scenario. That here is that they lived in a kingdom that was absolutely ordained by God, and a king, if he was doing it the right way, that was drawing them closer to God. In fact, he was enforcing laws that were given by God himself, not by the king, but by God himself. So it has an extra layer, certainly, in that Israel's covenant. But it's still true for us today that you obey the king because of your oath to God. That we're not obeying the government because of the government, we're obeying it because we're a Christian. Same reason you're a good husband. It's not just to please your wife, it's because that's what God wants you to do. Same way you treat your children, children treat their parents, is because of your relationship to God. Now, he's going to go on. Now, he said, first argument here, why do you obey the king? Because you made an oath to God. You're in a covenant relationship with God. That king is appointed by God. In Israel's case, he is supposed to be enforcing the law of God. So there's argument number one. He's going to make some other arguments why you need to obey the king. Do not be hasty to go from his presence. Now, I take that language to mean kind of a deserting, disloyalty. You're not saying don't be quick if he's giving a speech to get up and go home, when the speech is over, but the idea of departing from him in your loyalty, that you're not loyal to the king. So don't be hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand for an evil thing, for he does whatever pleases him. And so here seems to be argument number two is why you obey the king. Argument number one, and first and foremost, is you made an oath to God. And God has instituted, at least in Romans 13 case, in a broad, generic way, and or maybe in Solomon's case, in a very specific way. God has appointed him as king. Argument number two, though, seems to be different in verse 3, is for he does whatever pleases him. He's the king. And so another reason to obey the king is kind of like we used to tell our kids, especially when they were littler, why do I have to do it? Because I'm bigger than you. That's why. And so the king has this power. The king has the sword. The king has the army. The king can throw you in jail. The king can lop off your head. So there's practical argument number one. Why? Because the king can do whatever he wants. And so you stay loyal to him. Where the word of a king is, there is power, verse 4 says. So here's kind of the subset or the subtext of that main point. He does whatever he pleases. Where the word of the king is, there is power. And who may say to him, what are you doing? You don't say that to the king. And so, smart plan is get along, do what the king says, obey the law. For he who keeps his command will experience nothing harmful. And a wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment. I tell you, that's if we just rip that phrase out of its context, that's just good advice, isn't it? A wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment. There's a time and a place for everything. Is kind of the point there. There's a time maybe to do what you want to do and say what you want to say, but in front of the king is not that time. When you're in front of the king, when you're in that kingdom, wise man's heart says now is the time to obey the king. And also, I think it has maybe to do with this idea of judgment. And he's going to reference that a little bit later, the idea of delayed judgment. Well, what if I don't want to do what this king is saying? And what if this king isn't following God's law? Well, you let God take care of that. You obey the king. Now, I think Solomon would agree with us that there's obviously that Acts chapter 5 exception. We ought to obey God rather than men. So there may be times when there's a conflict and we have to make that stand. But here, I think he's just talking in generic terms of you do what the king says. Why? Because of God. And number two is because he's more powerful than you. And a wise man figures that out. Now's not the time to buck the system because it may cost me my life. Kyle?
Just another, I've always kind of thought of, and maybe I'm wrong, you never know if I am, but it reads to me, the king's evil or sinning, any kind of authority figure here is sinning, they need to hear the truth, and I've always thought that kind of meant a wise man kind of knows, and respect that authority, but when the time is right, he needs to hear. So kind of knowing, having the wisdom to know, you don't do it in front of a big bunch of people where you
Yeah,
offend the
yeah.
king, so you kind of have to have that wisdom. And I think it's that way with us in everyday life. We have people around us we'd like to have that conversation with. You don't do it again when you're in a crowd of other people. You
Yeah,
kind of wait till you can get them. And so I don't know. I've always kind of thought that was
yeah. And
another
that certainly,
possibility
yeah,
that he's talking about.
yeah, certainly could be that if you're going to say to the king, what are you doing? There's a time for that. And you're right. In the crowd of people, if there's other subjects, no. But if you know the king and you can get him aside and you have his ear, then yeah, I think that's a good point. But like I said, I just love that phrase: "A wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment." We can apply that to so many different aspects of life, um, because Here's finishing that thought in verse 6. Because for every matter there is a time and judgment. And so you discern that time and judgment because for every matter there's always the time for that. And there's always the judgment. Now, is he talking about man's judgment of when to broach a subject, not broach a subject? Or is he talking about just simply that there's a time for judgment? God will take care of that. It's not your job to fix the king. And I think that's a powerful, if that's what he's saying here, I think that's a powerful lesson for Christians today. Um, Christianity, American Christianity, we use those terms very broadly, has been heavily influenced by what was known as the social gospel movement. And the social gospel is maybe not what we in conservative churches of Christ think of. It doesn't mean the idea of having a potluck and dinner on the grounds, although that may be, kind of related to that. But the social gospel movement is much older than that, and it's the idea that the church, our job is to fix society, to fix its ills. Now, that might be in the sense if our community is hungry, then it's the church's job to feed them. And so we open up this soup kitchen, or we have this pantry, we do that. Or if the problem is they're immoral, then we need to insert ourselves into government and pass laws that are moral and follow God's rules and those kind of things. When there may be a part for those things, for the church or for individuals. But that's not really the primary purpose of the gospel. That's not the purpose of the church. Our purpose of the church is to lead people to Christ, lead individuals to Christ. And so we need to separate ourselves. Our job is not to fix the government and to fix the laws. Now, do we pray for those things? Absolutely. Do we try to influence those things as individuals? Absolutely. But it's not our job to fix Joplin's problems. It's not our job to fix Missouri's problems or America's problems. It's our job to go out here and to reach individual souls and hearts. Now, if that happens to a large enough degree, will that affect Joplin, Missouri, and America? Absolutely. But that's kind of the getting the cart before the horse. Our job is to affect individual hearts, and the rest of it's up to God. There'll be a time for His judgment. So there's a matter, every matter there is a time and judgment, though the misery of man increases greatly. The New American Standard says, when a man's trouble is heavy upon him. And so even though, you're oppressed by this situation, maybe you're oppressed by the king, there's a time for that. The time's not now for you to fix that. God will take care of that. For, Ecclesiastes 8, verse 7, he does not know what will happen. The miserable man doesn't. So who can tell him when it will occur? And you don't know the time for that judgment. You don't know the answer to those things. No one has the power. Now, here's where we're going to have some differences in our translations, I think. The New King James says, no one has power over the Spirit to retain the Spirit. Anybody have a different translation? Okay, wind. In Hebrew, Old Testament, Greek, New Testament, the word for spirit and wind are the same. In the New Testament, it's a word we're familiar with. It's the word pneuma. We have pneumatic tires. We get pneumonia that affects your breathing, and so it's the word wind can sometimes be translated spirit. The context has to determine: is that word mean spirit, or does that word mean wind? It depends on the context. The problem here is context doesn't really help us a whole lot. But that's the bad news. The good news is it really doesn't matter, because his point is not really about the wind or the spirit. That's kind of an illustration. And so whether he's talking about spirit or wind, it means the same. You can't control the wind, can you? No. You can't control the spirit, can you? No. And so the point is the same. That's not his conclusion. That's just an illustration. Just like you can't control the wind, just like you can't control the spirit, whichever he means here. And no one has power in the day of death. You can't control death, can you? And so there's the idea that we don't have that control. There is no discharge in that war. The war over wind or spirit, or the war over death, and wickedness will not deliver those who are given to it. And so don't frustrate yourselves in this role that you might have from the king. And I think maybe the assumption here, when you're talking about the being miserable, is that maybe you're being oppressed in this relationship. The king is oppressing you directly or indirectly. That certainly would have been the case in Solomon's day. And Solomon may have this in mind. Solomon was an oppressive king. If in no other sense, in that we think that we invented the IRS and high taxes. No, Solomon did that way before us. I mean, not that Solomon was the first to do that, but Solomon, remember that Solomon's son, when he took the throne, what was the initial request of some of the people to Solomon's son, his successor? Yeah, lower our taxes. We're still crying to politicians about that, aren't we? And so they had this oppressive, and so if nothing else, the oppression making them miserable was the high taxes. Now, certainly we know in history, even in biblical history, kings could oppress their people in other ways. And so he seems to be saying, you can't stop that. You can't stop the wind. You can't stop death. You can't stop the government from taxing you. You can't stop the government from enslaving you. You can't stop the government from passing laws that are oppressive or ungodly. And so just you need to just realize that. Don't frustrate yourself. And maybe this ties in to verse 1 of chapter 8. And we didn't talk about that when we were there, and we did that on purpose. Is, again, scholars don't know what to do with verse 1 of chapter 8. Is it a conclusion to chapter 7, or is it an introduction into chapter 8? And it fits either way. But if it's an introduction into chapter 8, I think he's saying, remember what verse 1 said? Who's like a wise man, and who knows the interpretation of the thing? A wise man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the sternness of his face is changed. The wise man figures this out, as opposed to verse 6, though the misery of man increases greatly. And so you're living under an oppressive government. And let's be all honest, to one degree or another, probably all governments are oppressive. Ours is oppressive in some way. We have a lot of freedoms. We have religious freedom, another kind of freedom, but we have high taxation. We have politicians passing laws and doing things that we don't agree with, certainly as Christians. And so your choice. Are you going to be miserable in that and try to fight against that all the time? Are you going to be that verse 1 wise man whose sternness of face changes and he starts to smile because he just says, fine, you can't fight City Hall. Just fine. Then I'm just going to live my life, and I'm not going to try to change the government because I can't. And so to me, that's the connection there of the wisdom that's there, because it's just like trying to stop the wind or trying to stop death. You can't stop the government from doing what they do. They have the power. You don't. And if you want to put a smile on your face, is when you can just flip that switch and just say, "I says, hey, that's the way it is. I might as well just grin and bear it." Mark?
There is one thing we can do, and that's vote to the choice, right?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we can vote, we can pray, we can try to even influence others to vote the right way. But if we're outnumbered, what are you going to do? You're going to pull your hair out. And not to get political and too, you know, relevant in time, but we see that with I don't know a better word than the madmen who just want to just shoot some political opponent and thinking that's going to change. You know, they just lose their mind because here's a politician or here's a speaker who says something I don't agree with, and I've got to stop it. And the only way I can stop it is to get a gun or a bomb. And no, no, you're miserable. You're certainly making other people miserable. You're better off to just say they're all a bunch of crooks. God will take care of them. And that's kind of what he's saying, isn't it? They're all a bunch of crooks. God will take care of them. I'm just going to live my life here. I'm going to vote. I'm going to put signs in my yard, do those kind of things, but it's not going to consume me. Larry? Yeah, and that's what he's saying here. Number one, you're going to obey him because you made an oath to God, but the other is because he's got the power. He's the bully, and you're the bully. If that's probably not the right word there, but you're the one being bullied, and so you just need to realize that you're going to be miserable. And a wise man, I think, is the one who recognizes that. All this I have seen, verse 9, and applied to my heart to every work that is done under the sun. And so Solomon says, I applied this to every work, because in some sense it didn't apply to Solomon, did it? Because he is the king, he is the government. But he says, I've applied this to everything. And that's probably true to the farmers in our audience. You need to just realize that much of farming is just out of your hands, isn't it? You can't control the wind, you can't control the rain, you can't control lightning, and you're going to be miserable in that experience, or you're going to flip that switch and say, hey, all I can do is plant it and harvest it, and the rest is up to nature, up to God, however you turn, and I'm just not going to overly fret about it because I can't control it. There is a time in which one man rules over another. Now, again, my translation says there's a time in which one man rules over another to his own hurt. Many translations just say there's a time in which man rules over another to his hurt. And that changes the meaning very drastically. They both can be true. I'm not sure which manuscript is right. If mine is right, there's a time in which one man rules over another to his own hurt, is saying the king is ruling over somebody else, oppressing him, and it's really just hurting the king. And if that's the point, then he's certainly maybe talking about, if nothing else, eternal judgment. The king's going to do that, and he's going to come in and make slaves out of people and oppress people, oppress the poor, and take bribes and do all of that thing. Then he's doing that to his own hurt, isn't he? Because God's going to get him. And I think that's much of the undertone here. There's that time for that judgment. But it's also true that when he's doing that, he's doing it, some translations bear out, to someone else's hurt. So either way, he's hurting himself, he's hurting his subjects. Maybe he's doing both, isn't he? He's hurting the subjects now, he's hurting himself for eternity, and that's just the way it is. Max?
This first part of verse 9, all this I have seen and applied my mind to every deed that has been done under the sun. And it's verses like this just jump out at me as we go through this book because, this is the guy that he has seen it all, done it all, been there, done that. And as compared to reading some other form of literature, what you kind of, yeah, it's easy to say, but what do you know about it? But he brings this up, this seems like every chapter or so, he'll point out, hey, I've been there. I know what I'm talking about. This is what it's like.
Yeah.
And it just lends a new relevance to it to listen to me. I've been there. I understand this.
Yeah. I've been there to a degree nobody else has. And so, yes, that wisdom is there. And I'm going to tell you, there's something, and I'm preaching to myself and just letting y'all listen because I think I've shared with you before in our study of Ecclesiastes. I have this unhealthy sense of justice, that I want justice. And Deidre gets mad at me because when we're driving, she says, you're not the policeman, right? You can't make these people drive the way they ought to. And I'll tell on myself, when we were in the Birmingham area, we lived in the preacher's house right next to the church building. And I saw a group of 7 or 8 teenagers doing donuts in our parking lot and throwing their cans and their trash out in the churchyard. Well, with Mr. Sense of Justice here, I got in my little pickup truck and I followed them 6 miles to their house and made them come back and pick up that trash. Deidre thought I was crazy because she'd gone and picked up the trash while I was chasing after them. And I got home, I told her, I said, you throw the trash back out there, these punks are going to pick it up. And they did, to their credit. But there's just I have an unhealthy sense of justice that something's got to be fixed, and he's saying the wise man doesn't have that. The wise man just can smile because he recognizes that, and to be almost sinister about it, the wise man can smile because he thinks God's going to get you. I don't have to. God's going to get you in that, and that this life is not going. And you think about it, you're much happier once you accept the fact that this life is not fair. And that's much of what the book of Ecclesiastes is saying, isn't it? This life ain't fair, and what's crooked you can't make straight. And the sooner you come to terms with that, the happier you'll be. And again, that's not, maybe it's partially about getting to heaven, but it's really just about understanding life under the sun. All right, verse 10. Then I saw the wicked buried, who had come and gone from the place of holiness. What's the place of holiness, do we think? I think it's probably the temple. The place of holiness where God dwells in the Jewish mind, at least, and where he is worshipped. And so I see wicked people. So we have to paint this picture here. Here are wicked people going to the temple. They're coming and going to the temple. And so we'll modernize it. Here's somebody that comes to church every Sunday, but they're wicked. They're ungodly, but they're going through the motions. They're trying to fool everybody. And we understand, and maybe the whole point of this is they're not fooling God, but two options about the rest of us. I'm assuming the rest of us aren't the wicked people. But we either are fooled by them, and that's a possibility. Here's somebody that's coming even to Newman Road. I'm not trying to make you suspicious, but somebody's coming to Newman Road every Sunday, but they're just wicked, and we don't know it. We think they're good Christians, and so there's option number one. Option number two is that we just kind of go along with it. We know they're wicked, and they come to church, and we just don't say anything about it. And so with those two options, he says, I see the wicked buried, who've come and gone from the place of holiness, and they were forgotten in the city where they had so done. The NIV says praised or forgotten. And so big difference between those two words, maybe not in the concept here, is that here's the idea that here's this, if I'm understanding this verse 10 rightly, and we've probably all experienced this. Did I tell you, I think I told you the joke before about the funeral when the preacher's up there just praising this man, and he was a wonderful man in the community and honest and upright, and the widow elbows her son and says, get up and see it, make sure that's your daddy. And that, we all been there where the preacher just preaches the guy into heaven, and I think that's what he's saying here is, here's this wicked person, and maybe option B, what we talked about earlier, and everybody knew he was wicked, but he goes to the temple, and then when he dies, he's either, if the NIV is right, he's praised. The preacher just praises him, preaches him into heaven, or we just forget all the bad that he did. And so there's, again, the inequities of life. This also is vanity. Because, and here's another area of frustration, potential frustration, because the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore, the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. Justice, swift justice is the best form of justice. And if there's this delay, and I don't think delay here, the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily. I don't think it's talking about where my mind immediately wants to go is, I think, maybe I started to say virtually, I think literally every death row in America. That if you're on death row in America, it's going to be decades, if it ever happens. You may die of natural causes, but if the state ever does execute you, if you're executed today, it's for a crime you committed in the 80s, maybe the 90s if they're fast. And so it's not talking about that. I think it's talking about the idea of that they're getting away with it. It's not that you're going to prison and there's this delay before sentencing or the delay before the execution. I think here is talking about maybe the delay for God's judgment. That here they're just getting away with it. And you think about it in those terms that hundreds of years they've gotten away with it. And so then our mind naturally wants to go that we're set to do evil. Oh, we're getting away with that? Then I'll do that. And that's just almost the natural human mindset, isn't it? Oh, we can do that and get away with it? Then I'll do it. Max?
I think we've all experienced the frustration or whatever of reading in the Old Testament where the family does bad, the dad steals the silver and buries it under the tent, and the whole family gets killed. You know, the judgment was swift, and yet 5 years later, they're all doing the same thing again. And that's what this jumps out at me. You know, it's not executed quickly, therefore the hearts of the Son of Men are given fully to do evil. So, you know, that in other words, it's going to happen either way, whether the judgment happens quickly or whether
how quickly we forget. Yeah, and we're inclined to do that evil. Though a sinner, verse 12, though a sinner does evil 100 times, and his days are prolonged yet. And so again, here's this potential source of frustration. Here's somebody that's not just, he did one thing, and that was just kind of a momentary lapse in judgment. But here's a guy that's just doing it over and over again. He's getting away with it. And not only that, but what's the old saying? Only the good die young. Here, this guy, the wicked guy, if anybody needs to get hit by a bus, it's that guy. But he lives to be 120, and he's just wicked. And we just think that's not fair. That's not fair. Yet I surely know, verse 12, that it will be well with those who fear God, who fear before him. If my understanding is right, all of these phrases, all of these verses point back to verse 1, where the wise man has that understanding and his countenance changes. That stern face becomes a smile because he's just smiling and going, okay, but it's still better to serve God. This wicked person's getting away with it. He's getting rich. I'm serving God and I can barely pay my bills, but it's still better to serve God because there's a time for that judgment that is coming. But it will not be well with the wicked. You may think it is, and right now it is, but it will not be well with the wicked, nor will he prolong his days, which are as a shadow, because he does not fear before God. So his days were prolonged in verse 12, but then in verse 13 he says his days aren't prolonged. So how do we reconcile that apparent contradiction? He said in verse 12, the wicked man's days will be prolonged, but then he says in verse 13, but his days won't be prolonged. Mark? Yeah, there you go. It may be another way of rephrasing that is that we get frustrated. He's getting away with it. And God's on his throne saying, he's not getting away with it. So did he get away with it? Yeah, he did. The courts didn't catch him. The police didn't catch him. He died with all that money that he swindled other people with. So did he get away with it? Yeah, in that sense he did. But he didn't. And so were his days prolonged? Yeah, but not really. Because there's going to be a reckoning for that. There is a vanity which occurs on earth, that there are just men to whom it happens according to the wicked. Again, there are wicked men to whom it happens according to the work of the righteous. I say this also is vanity. Again, life ain't fair. There's some wicked people that get rewarded for their wickedness. Good people get punished for their goodness. That's life ain't fair. So, what does he say? Verse 15, and we'll wrap up with this. So I commended enjoyment, because a man has nothing better under the sun than to eat, drink, and be merry. for this will remain with him in his labor for the days of his life, which God gives him under the sun. And so life ain't fair. The king has all the power, and ain't a thing you can do about it. Wicked people are getting away with it, on this life at least. And so what do? Enjoy life. Don't focus on that and let that destroy your joy. Just keep your head down, mind your own business, and enjoy life. That's what the wise man does. And his frown has been turned into a smile, because that's not my, what's the newer saying, not my circus, not my monkeys. It's just, that's not my problem. It's not my problem to fix the inequities of life. It's God's problem, and he'll do it in his time, and he'll do it perfectly. He doesn't need your help to be the avenger of all the wrongs in this life and to be fretted by that. Just enjoy, eat, drink, and be merry, he says. That's what God has given you to do. All right, we'll pick up there next time.